We are on another Decades Artist Spotlight. Our second interview tonight. Award-winning director, producer, editor, and documentary filmmaker. His current project is called Dark Side of the Mountain, which we will be talking about tonight. But first, one of my favorite topics, the Amityville Horror, his incredible documentary, My Amityville Horror. Please welcome Mr. Eric Walter. How you doing, Eric?
Hi, how you doing, Joe? Pleasure to be here.
I mean, the Amityville Horror it was my first R-rated movie I ever saw, and to this day, still the scariest movie I ever saw. And before we get to Amityville, I want to talk a little bit about you because tell us how you started out. Go back and what got you into filmmaking. And I know you have a big resume, so let's talk a little bit about that first.
Oh my gosh, I don't think we have enough time for the entire story. But yeah, no, to condense it all down, mainly, my interest in documentary filmmaking generated purely out of my interest for the unknown and the unsolved, I think.
Right.
Art Bell's program, the original Coast to Coast AM. I used to listen to that as a kid, in the 90s, early 90s, listening to that and absorbing that overnight.
Right.
Thanks to my dad, got me into the right things at an early age. That and programs like Unsolved Mysteries were a huge influence. I think I was, apart from narrative storytelling, I was always interested in cases of alleged true events that happened to real people and things, stories that you could mine and research yourself. And I, to this day, still get involved in cold cases to a large extent, a lot of no one ever sees in terms of my research. And I work with a small team here based in California, but we, investigate these cases and I've always been doing that my entire life. And Amityville was something, I grew up in Maryland, on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and moved out to Los Angeles when I guess I was 22. But before that, I was, very close to Long Island and had been interested not as much in the movies, the films and everything that's been out there that Hollywood has put out there about the Amityville horror, but mainly about the story.
Right.
and what, where it all really came from, the murders, there was a horrible mass murder that was committed in the house by Ronald DeFeo Jr. in 1974, as well as, just a few months later, George and Kathy Lutz and their 3 children moved into the house and really set the house onto another level of infamy that has never stopped snowballing to this day. And part of, even my own content, having gotten involved in this, and ever since I made this documentary about Daniel Lutz, My Amityville Horror, I am being contacted constantly about interviews about him. So, in a way, I've become involved in this to a degree I never fathomed or anticipated. So it is an interesting, as soon as you start to delve into this case, and for many years I didn't want to talk about it anymore. Because there is a lot of darkness in the story, as well as just attached to the people involved in the story. And I've just been very close to the flame for many years. And so it's been interesting sort of reflecting on that, because the film has been out for a number of years now.
You've become quite you're known on the internet as the Amityville Expert now. So how do you feel about that? Everywhere I look, it says Eric Walter, Amityville Expert.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel. I think the first show that I was interviewed for, they surprisingly put lower third on the documentary, like Amityville historian, and I'm like, I don't know if I've earned that title, but whatever that means. But yeah, no, it's very strange. But no, I appreciate that and everything. But it's I like to talk about my experience and not about anyone else's experience. I certainly know the facts surrounding everyone else's, but I about what happened, of course, in the house, and we can talk about that. But
right.
But I had my own experiences making. I mean, in many ways, there was a horror in and of itself making my Amityville horror documentary. So yeah, there's a lot to it, a lot to unpack here.
So, how did the documentary get started? Because for years, um, the kids didn't talk. I know Chris, who has a different last name. I think it goes by Christopher Quarantino. Is that right?
Quartino,
Right,
Quartino, yeah, which is their, original. That's
right.
his father's name,
And
right?
he always said he was going to say something, and of course, he has a different story than other people. But how did it get started that you decided to do this and get in touch with Daniel? Right out of the blue.
So backing, yeah, exactly, because it could have been anyone. I mean,
Right.
I had no resume at that point. I was complete unknown, and so um, I was very young when this all happened. So backing up just a few steps, when I was still on the East Coast, a friend of mine and I developed a website, kind of an archive around the Amityville case, and at that time it was popular and had a forum, and we just put up a lot of archival materials, documents and trial transcripts, photographs, maps of the house, you name it, everything was up there, in kind of an interesting, creative way that no one had done before. And one thing led to another. I moved out to the West Coast and was contacted by a gentleman in Whitestone, New York, which is, area of Queens, New York,
Right.
and said that, I'm in contact with Danny Lutz and he wants to tell his story. And we found you because of your website. And I'm just like, I didn't even believe the guy, to be honest. At first, I thought that this was a lot of, somebody's pulling my leg or something like this. So I asked to see a picture and to talk with him, of course. And as soon as I saw the photograph, I knew that it definitely was Daniel. The likeness to Kathy Lutz was very striking. And yeah, I mean, obviously I was just extremely intrigued. I was, let's see, at that point I was probably 24 years old. So this has been, a number of years ago. And this was about like 2009 time frame. And so, yeah, one thing led to another. We had conversations. Daniel was very reserved over the phone. I was wanting to meet with them. Took some time to get that to happen, in terms of, him wanting to trust anyone. I know that Christopher, anybody that knows anything about this case, like you mentioned, Christopher has sort of flirted with, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to do a documentary, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. And, in many ways, it's almost good that he probably hasn't, not to speak for him, but, just getting involved in this, as much as I'd like to know his side of the story, it does, there's a stigma to this whole thing that once you get involved in this, once you go public, I mean, that's part of the whole commentary of Miami the Horror, was the fact that George and Kathy allowed the use of their children's names in that book, and forever they've been living in the shadow of this thing. The entire family has. And so Christopher, has never come forward. And, I thought this is likely to be a very similar situation to that of Christopher not eventually not speaking, but flirting with the idea. And so anyway, Daniel agreed to meet with me. I flew to New York and met with him. I think I was there 4 or 5 days. And I didn't bring cameras. I didn't bring a crew. I didn't bring anything like that. Because I didn't want to scare him off, mainly. I didn't want to, it's intimidating. And also I wanted to get the real thing. I really wanted to get to know him and to see, why now? And as far as why me, you asked, I mean, mainly it's because I had sort of carved out, even at that young age, carved out sort of a trench for myself in terms of this case, and being, I guess, as you said, an expert in it.
Right.
I had been to Amityville for many years. I had gone, met with the Historical Society, which is not always an easy thing to do in terms of this case. And then also just knew the lay of the land as far as the story. I had a lot of access to archival. I was friends with, various investigators who had worked on the case, many of which were still alive at this point. They're no longer alive. But so, yeah, flew there, had an audio recorder with me, a digital audio recorder. and was recording audio, no video, no film, was just recording audio of our conversations. And oddly enough, we were on his friend had a boat, and we were just down in, he wanted a super private area. So we were down in this, basically little apartment on the boat. And Danny's, chain smoking, rambling on, and mostly about George and his, hatred of the man.
Yeah, he really is not like that guy. That's one thing you can tell.
Well, no, and I, and part of me was very, and still to this day, is very, my whole in terms of my intentions and his intentions, it's interesting, the relationship always between a filmmaker and the subject, right? How did this all happen? How did you come to this place? Obviously, I had an interest in the case. He had the experience of actually being there, and this whether it was true or not, he was part of it. Now, he was dead set and determined to convince me and everyone that was in the room during the filming, and the entire time he swears up and down that everything that has been said about it, at least by him, was true. That the house was indeed haunted, but he felt that it was not brought on by the DeFeo murders, which I found interesting. He felt that the energy there was something that had been unlocked and unleashed by his stepfather, George Lutz, who, for anyone who's not aware, George Lutz is sort of the figurehead of the Lutz family and of the story up until 2006 when he passed away, which is very interesting that, it's not just a few years later is when this opportunity landed in my lap. And so, for Danny to be willing to talk and people starting to be more willing to talk after George passed away is telling in and of itself. I mean, they really were afraid of the guy.
It's interesting because I had the opportunity to talk to George Lutz in 2000, and right before before the remake came out, I had the opportunity to talk to him. And talking to him, you would never think, when you hear Danny's story and and obviously just talking to him as a media standpoint, he obviously believed everything he said. He did not like the movies. He was irate about the remake that came out in 2005.
With good reason.
Right. And exactly. It was horrible.
Right.
But
right.
When you hear Danny talk about him and the George that I talked to,
sure.
Obviously I didn't live with the guy. I wasn't. But it was odd because I didn't feel that from George. He seemed like a very quiet, nice guy. When I hear Danny talk about him, I'm like, wow. But you never know what goes behind.
You never know what. Yeah, I think you were just about to say the same thing I was going to say. Is you don't know what's. And I think Danny says you don't know what happens behind closed doors.
Yep.
He says that in the film, I believe. And it's hard for me to comment. I don't know either. None of us do. And I, of course, ethically, is it fair to demonize someone post-mortem, to be saying someone did XYZ? Well, to me, this story of Daniel Lutz, which was immediate, I went in thinking, hey, this is going to be a unique, this is close to the flame as you can get as far as getting an actual inside the house perspective of what happened, even though, yes, he was 9-10 years old at the time. This is going to be the closest you're going to get. George and Kathy are passed, and this is it. So I came away from those conversations realizing that whether or not you believe this guy, he was haunted. He was a haunted man, and this was less about a haunted house, more about a haunted man, and more about the specter, the spirit, if you will, of his stepfather invading everything in his life. I mean, in a way, really, if you want to believe in the demon in his version of the story was George, which I found fascinating in and of itself. Because George, Danny in many ways is sort of the black sheep of the family, and not just because of his hatred of George, but he ran away from home. I've since found out more about that whole story since actually filming the documentary. But he ran away from home. He separated himself from the family largely because of George, and their relationship was so cataclysmic. Laura DiDio, who's a very good friend of mine, investigative reporter with Channel 5 News, who appeared in the documentary,
Right.
as well as was involved in this case for many years and responsible for bringing a lot of people into the fray that were involved with it, the Warrens, Hans Holzer, etc. And she also confirmed many of the things that, not literally the things, Danny talks about in terms of George's abilities, and we'll get to that later. But how George was strung very tightly. He was almost, used the word came to fisticuffs with Ed Warren over just, the semantics of how the house was going to be investigated and whatnot. And I've also, he was very litigious, let's say, during his lifetime, got involved with many lawsuits, which a lot I can imagine would be understandable from people trying to tell your story and for you. And but there were many, there's a cloud of drama surrounding George, despite later in life, him being kind of a calm presence.
Very mellow, yes.
Yeah,
right.
And there's a consistency to George and Kathy's statements. A lot of people, this is what actually really annoys me. If you go on any of these websites, besides the ones that are more reputable, there's, just the consensus that this was an admitted hoax, that George and Kathy did all of this for profit, which they could have, by the way. I'm not ruling that out.
You'll never know.
But they said this, and then it was reported that this, there was no storm the night that they claimed there was a storm. Well, I mean, that's not much different than claiming that your bed's levitating or these other things that they claim. I mean, nobody, if there's levitation happening, I suppose there could be some sort of disembodied storm happening
right.
too. I don't know what they were claiming was going on. And I struggle with those parts of the story myself, in terms of believing that, that these things were actually getting to that place. However, it never was my intention as a filmmaker, a storyteller, to get involved in this in the way of like, I'm going to, cram down the throats of everyone watching this, what the filmmaker's opinion. I've actually, the one thing that's been consistent in terms of the documentary is that I allowed Daniel to speak his story without judging him from an editorial perspective. We certainly introduced elements of psychological commentary in terms of, and there were, rightly, many things within Daniel's testimony that he spoke about that seemed like he was, false memories that had been implanted from watching the movie and seeing himself portrayed as a character in the original film and all, the remake, and you name it, just, countless iterations on television of these events being replayed, and it's the game of telephone.
He seemed
just never stops.
He seemed very intimidating. I mean, the one point,
oh my God,
was it you at the end of the movie when he looked at you and he said, "We're gonna have words"?
Oh God, you have no idea.
I got freaked out. I'm thinking, oh my God.
Well, there was a reason that I adopted the whole, if you're familiar with filmmaker Errol Morris, he does the Interrotron approach, right, which is the right down the pipe of the lens, visual, intimate contact with the viewer. And to me, when I was sitting on that boat those days, when I first met with him in person, and he was extremely intimidating, and I'm like, Jesus, there's nothing scarier than, I don't need Jody the Flying Pig. I just have him I just need him sitting in a chair, staring down, through the lens at people.
He was intimidating, no doubt.
From that day on, I mean, and especially starts describing how he felt possessed himself. Yeah, there's certain parts in that, man, that his testimony is. I kept everything super raw to not a lot of manipulation um, in post. You know, it was very. I left even a lot of the stammering he did in there and everything. I don't know. It's certainly, if anything within the Amityville, legion of films, the subgenre that's been developed around this true story, is that it stands alone as sort of a character study amidst all of the horror movies and the countless documentaries that have come before it. I mean, for some reason, just in the last year and a half, there's been a resurgence of this story. There's been numerous TV shows. There's another one coming out that and Laura DiDio and I were just interviewed for as well, for the History Channel, as well as numerous ones that are coming out. So I don't know what it is about this story, but it seems to ebb and flow, and peaks of interest come and go.
Well, yeah, just this year you had the Discovery Plus, and then you had, I think,
Right.
I saw one on, I think it was Tubi. Is that the Tubi?
Yeah, no, I wasn't a part of that one.
Yeah, you weren't a part of that, but they had one on there, and
they did contact me, but it didn't sound like something I wanted to be involved in.
Yeah, it was. There wasn't much to it, to tell you the truth. It was, what. But
Right.
getting back to Daniel, I mean, he was scary. I mean, I've seen your documentary many times. That's why I know some of these parts by heart. But when at the one point when you're sitting with Lorraine and she asks who believes in God, he got like very upset when he looked at the crew, and he looked back.
Well, it was me.
Yeah, well, I figured it was your voice. Yes, and he got very upset.
And I never wanted to identify it as me.
Right.
It didn't matter who it was.
It didn't matter.
And so, because my perspective doesn't matter I didn't want it to matter to anyone. I just thought, and some people during the editing process, I remember a few of the producers like, why do you want to leave this in there? And I was like, because the biggest thing for me, up to that point in the film, he had been rambling on about the story and what happened in the house as much as he could remember. And it's around from that point on in the film I really love the progression of what happens after, because that point in the film, for me, lifts the veil on his immediate acceptance of the Lorraine presenting this crucifix. His emotional reaction to it was, I mean, if he's believing this, what else is he believing in? And that's just my perspective.
Lorraine had a way of making it feel good. We also talked with her, and when I talked to her, I felt like she made you feel so good.
Absolutely.
I mean, you were talking to her on the phone. You just felt it was like a light around you.
Absolutely.
It was so strange. I came to my wife. I was like, wow. I mean, this woman really. There was something special about her.
Yeah, I mean, she, and I think a lot of people that are critical of the Warrens too. I mean, there's this certain personality trait that she is warm and caring, and I think she was able to bring people in. At least I can't speak for Ed myself, because I didn't get to, I didn't have the advantage of meeting him in person. But with Lorraine, we arrived at her home very early in the morning. She's still getting ready for, I guess she hadn't gotten the note that we were going to be there at, I guess, 7 a.m. or something like that. And but she's, just so lovely. Like, oh yeah, just go downstairs. So we're downstairs in her, in the Warrens Occult Museum area. And yeah, just a crazy, for somebody interested in Amityville to be wandering around with Danny Lutz in the Warrens basement is, that's a unique experience, I'd say.
A little creepy.
But that whole in front of the, and this was before the Annabelle movies.
Right, the Conjuring and all that, right.
Yeah, all of that came out. I believe, Amityville released, or My Amityville Horror released the very year that the first Conjuring came out.
2012, right?
Right.
2013, yeah.
2013, yeah. So it was interesting because, Danny's, right, there is a shot of Annabelle in in the film, but I would have probably made it a little bit more. I would have framed it a little differently if I had known.
You timed that perfectly with the Conjuring coming out and having
right, exactly. Yeah. Well, I might have made had a shot of his face like reflected in the glass case or something. The things you would have done differently now.
We are on another Decades Artist Spotlight. Eric Walter is with us. My Amityville Horror. We got a lot more to talk about. Don't go anywhere. Our second half of our interview with Eric coming up next right here in his Decades. Happy Halloween. We are live everywhere in the world. Decades with JoeyKramer.com, the Radio Bold app for your iPhone or Android device. And of course, right here on the river. 105 and 103.5. Right back with Eric Walter next. Hang on. Let's get back to our second special guest tonight in the Decades Artist Spotlight, Eric Walter, My Amityville Horror, as we continue a little talk about the Warrens.
I certainly have questions around the Warrens' work myself. I certainly never contested or protested or said anything to her. I thought Lorraine was lovely.
Yeah, she is.
She was a wonderful
or she was, I'm sorry.
person. Yeah, she was. Yeah, and she everyone was extremely warm and gracious. And so just those raw reactions of Danny, talking about his experience of going to the desert and, just the subtext of, she was just flashing these looks at Laura from across the table. And I just left all that in there because it just felt, along with the audience, you're learning all this kind of shocking information about his childhood.
So if you,
and
go ahead.
It was very revealing.
So, I mean, it's been, God, I can't believe it's been in almost 9 years since you did this documentary. But
I know.
Have you had any contact with him since then? With Daniel?
Oh, have I had any contact with him? Yes, I have. I sort of admittedly keep my distance, for my own protection.
Yeah.
But he when the film released, it was all fine and everything was great. And he was happy and thanked me. And then for some reason, somewhere along the line after the film came out, he decided he was going to turn the tables and hate everyone. And, from my understanding, he was online at some point or on Facebook and was piping off on there. Honestly, I had to close the door to all that because it's just, trying to be objective about it. You have to put distance between this person, meaning Danny. Just there's no. If anything, I learned about him demonizing me and the project was also similar to possibly his demonizing of his stepfather.
Right, and he
demonizes those people and enlarges it, and everything is 110% bigger in terms of an issue to him than it may be in reality. And we did, I don't know if he really realizes it, because maybe like Christopher, he would have preferred to have directed it himself. I don't know. But the main thing is that it was, I gave him every advantage, probably more than if, I was an independent filmmaker. If some Hollywood, a network or a studio had gotten involved from that at that point, it would have been a completely different thing. It would have been, a retread likely of the same old story with his story woven into it. I really was sort of coming at it as an Amityville fanboy. Really. Right. At that time, I certainly have evolved since then. I was becoming more. I was a fan of the book and very interested in the story, the actual events. But leaving those first conversations, it sort of swung me away, or just opened my perspective of seeing that there was something much more real and intimate and dark behind all of this. Whether it was true or not, this was very real for him in his mind. And the real story really, to me, was the horror that those kids had to endure. Right. As well. The entire family was fractured over this. George and Kathy, I believe it was 1987 they were divorced. George, Kathy passed in 2004, George in 2006. Very soon after the whole litigation over the remake had been resolved, and many people have told me that that almost drove him to having a heart attack. I mean, he was in many ways he yeah, this thing, it haunted all of them in different ways, and I know Christopher still has not come forward with it. Maybe someday he will, and
what
if
about
he
Missy?
wants to, I hope he does.
What about Missy?
She yeah, fortunately, she stayed away from the story and has not publicly opened up at all, and that's commendable from her perspective. I mean, at least she's been able to put it in a place, and she was so young. I mean, she was 5 years old.
Yeah, I know, but she was with Jody. She was with the pig.
Right.
So,
And I know, it's interesting that, well, who knows what happened.
Right. Nobody knows.
So
when I talked to George, I walked away and I'm like, man, this was real. And then you hear other people and you're like, well, maybe. And then with Daniel, it's like you said before, how much of it was real and how much of it, like you said, he saw the movies, his fight with George, what was it? And I don't think we'll ever know.
Well, it would have been to reiterate what I said before, it was very interesting that Danny, for being as angry as he was at George, didn't come out before George passed. He waited till after he died to come out. And so in a small way, it's only my sneaking suspicion that he also was afraid of the guy.
Right.
Certainly he wouldn't have said the things he had said on camera. On camera, he might have in person, but he wouldn't have said the things he would have said publicly in that manner if he still had been around.
Now, the owners of this house over the years, I mean, everybody knows there's been a ton of owners. The house goes up for sale. It never sells for what it's worth, which is, but, and I always said to my wife, I'd love to buy it and make it into a bed and breakfast. Could you imagine the money it would make?
I also think that there is some sort of backroom dealing going on, and not to be conspiratorial, but I do think that the village of Amityville has some sort of agreement with whomever owns the house that will never happen.
Right. That's what I said to her. I said, I guarantee, because they've done everything they can to make it hard to try to find that house, between changing the address, making a lot of one-way streets. That's right. They make it very hard to find that house. But has there ever been anybody who's lived in a house that has talked about anything?
There's been various stories, but nothing of any consequence, and they're just that, stories. I have not verified them myself or spoken to them, so I'd be hesitant to repeat them here. But I know that certainly, the people that moved into the house following the Lutzes, the Cromartie family, they moved into the house and then, of course, immediately turned around and sued the Lutzes and I believe the movie studio, and I believe Jansen was involved in the lawsuit too. I may be incorrect on that, but there were lawsuits that were leveled at the Lutzes for, perpetrating, they said, a fraud on the public and making money on this, private residence and all the rest of this. But you don't move into a house like that.
Right. Who would buy that house?
They knew exactly. I mean, it stood empty for quite a time after, the Lutzes basically gave it back to the bank. This is also baked into why I think there was more going on to this. I do think the Lutzes were actually afraid of something. I do. And until I see, there's never going to be any hard evidence unless we develop a time machine and go back to those those moments in time to see what was actually happening within those walls. We're never going to know. But their actions afterward. First of all, George is looking in all things, a phone book for a parapsychologist or a ghost hunter, who he comes up with, a gentleman named Stephen Kaplan, who, by all intents and purposes, was not the person he needed to be looking into this. But Steve Kaplan ended up becoming sort of a detractor of the case, or calling it a hoax, after George realized that he was was crediting himself as a vampireologist, and he kind of got scared off by just how he was promoting himself, I suppose. And of course, Steve Kaplan and his wife then went on this, parade of trying to tear the case down publicly, and even wrote a book, The Amityville Horror Conspiracy, which is actually a very interesting read. But then
it's odd that you said vampire, because there's a new movie out, Amityville Vampire.
I've lost track. That's news to me. I've lost count at this point. People ask me about the movies all the time, and I certainly know the originals, and I know Dan Farron's has done some stuff, and it just keeps getting retread. But I don't know. I don't keep.
There were four.
The movies are so bad.
4 Amityville movies out in 2020: the Amityville Horrors, the Amityville Poltergeist, Witches of Amityville, Amityville Island, and then this year Amityville Vampire.
My God.
And they have nothing to do with the house or anything. That's
sure. Well, we've gotten back into like the direct-to-video, like 80s, early 90s era of like just Amityville Dollhouse, Amityville. You just slap the Amityville name on it.
Evil escapes.
What would be great is I've always wanted to, if you could ever get the rights to do it, it would be phenomenal to do a top-tier premium recreation of the DeFeo murders and the Amityville Horror, the book, the whole case, done in a lavish production and with good people.
Right.
So it's always been
not like that disaster
to
in
me.
2005.
It's always been just B horror stuff, and as much as I do have an affinity for the original, certainly for nostalgia reasons, and the sequel is actually quite interesting as well as a horror film. Actually, more entertaining in some ways.
The Possession.
The Possession.
I thought that was a pretty good movie. It wasn't that bad. I mean,
as a horror film,
right,
apart from thinking about this part of the case, but it's hard for me to. I guess because I'm too close to the story now that it's just hard. All of this seems so. My perspective is sort of skewed by all that, so it's hard for me to comment really. But so getting back to it, all of these people, Laura DiDio got the Warrens involved, and Ed and Lorraine Warren, of course, organized 2 searches of the house. One was an initial sweep of the house where later on Ed claimed that there was a legion of demons that assailed him when he was descending the stairs into the basement. Laura DiDio was there, and she said, I was there. There was no legions of demons. It's things like this. And then, who knows what he was seeing. But then also, the infamous March 6, 1976 investigation where members of Duke University's parapsychology department attended, Ed Lorraine Warren, various psychics, and Channel 5's news crew, cameraman, and Marvin Scott, the on-camera anchor, or reporter rather, and Laura DiDio, who is the very young producer who was on that, who had orchestrated all of this. And after the Warrens basically came back to George and Lutz following the seance they performed, and they all stayed in the house overnight. They claimed that that the house would need to be, they would have to have a Roman Catholic priest go into the house and say mass in the house, and George wasn't willing to do it. He wasn't willing to do it, and claimed that he didn't want to put anyone's life at risk. They even claimed that when they were staying at their Kathy's mother's house, which is where they kind of fled to in West Babylon, New York, which is near Amityville, so they were just staying nearby, that they continued, they had other levitation experiences.
That was in the second book, not the movie, obviously, but in the second book.
The John G. Jones book, yeah.
It was talked, but the story is interesting. Obviously, I mean, My Amityville Horror. Everybody listening, if you haven't seen it yet, you got to check it out. Before we run out of time, I want to talk about your new documentary about Tom Young and Keith Reinhardt. It's an incredible story, The Dark Side of the Mountain. Let's talk a little bit about this documentary.
Yes. Yes, and the film, to report everyone, so the film, yeah, as Joe mentioned, is Dark Side of the Mountain. If you go to darksidedoc.com, you can check out a little bit about the story and what the case is about. But mainly, it's a missing persons case, a dual missing persons case from the 1980s in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And it's centered around a gentleman named Tom Young, who was a bookshop owner in this small town of 130 people, very, very small town named Silver Plume, Colorado, which is a former mining town from the 1880s. That was abandoned after the silver crash,
Right.
and got down to about 50 people in the 50s, and was very, very desolate before there was a freeway put in there. Now it's right along the side of a freeway. However, it's still very desolate. It's still very cut off. It's still very, very interesting. And this village, basically, Tom Young, this man was living. He had this black lab. He owned this bookshop, had a very kind of meager existence there, until he disappeared in September of 1987 without a trace. No one knew what had happened to him, and rumors started swirling about what did happen and what could have happened, and until a friend of his, a journalist from Chicago named Keith Reinhardt, moved to the town. He had been coming to Silver Plume for years and had a friend there who owned the building that Tom Young had been renting to have his bookshop in. And so Keith Reinhardt moved into the summer of 1988. So this would have been the following 11 months after Tom Young's disappearance. Keith Reinhardt moved into this same shop where Tom had his store and opened up an antique shop there. And being a writer, was very interested in Tom Young's case and what happened, and began writing sort of a novel based on Tom Young's disappearance and all of the kind of rumor and mystery surrounding it. And one day on July 31st of 87, or 88 rather, sorry, Tom Young's remains were found. He and his dog had both been shot in the head. Gun was found on the scene, and it was initially ruled suicide, but it soon began revealed that the bullets that were found on the scene did not conclusively match the weapon that was found on the scene. So it started, and then also the bodies had been covered by a tarp. So it was a very suspicious scene. Keith Reinhardt, of course, was penning this novel, and literally just days after this happened, Keith Reinhardt himself also disappeared under very similar circumstances to how Tom Young had disappeared. And one of the largest search and rescue missions that was ever launched in the history of Colorado was, got off after Keith's disappearance. A pilot on the 5th day of the search, searching the mountain, crashed and was killed. There were hundreds of people on the side of that mountain searching, and to this day there was nothing ever found of Keith. And so from this, there have been numerous conspiracy theories and rumors that have blossomed out of this, just not knowing what happened. And I really got involved in this case because it was also something that was a small segment, a 10-minute segment had been profiled in the early 90s on Unsolved Mysteries, the Robert Stack original show. And I was fascinated with just the idea that this guy, Keith Reinhardt, who had been writing this novel that was sort of based on himself and Tom Young. And what made this so fascinating is after he disappeared, the investigators went into his, into his building where he had been writing this, and found that the story, the final paragraphs, and almost it read like a description of what Keith himself did the day he disappeared.
Well, Silver Plume had a lot of, from what I've read about it, dark history. A lot of weird stuff happened in that place for the 100 years.
Well,
prior
and
to
that's
it.
that's part of what the film is. The beginning of the film goes into this entire, almost like a storybook approach of telling some of the dark history that has happened in Silver Plume, and much of which kind of mirrors to a T what happened to Tom Young and Keith Reinhardt. So you had this very weird, bizarre, reverberating history of deaths and disappearances that have happened in that small town. But as you can imagine, a town like that, any kind of tragedies that happen are magnified so much more than any large city or any other place. So it's a very interesting. The film is finished, for anyone wondering.
Yeah, when is it going to be coming out?
Next year is the year we're targeting. Date TBD. We got thrown off a little bit with the pandemic. We were planning to have it out a year earlier, but festivals kind of went down the tubes in 2020. So, and then we went out hunting for some more archival bits and things, and I just perfected my cut. But the good news is the cut is finished and it's beautiful. And so right now, and yeah, there's some great things happening as I speak with that right now. So there's going to be, we have our trailer and everything cut, and so I'm just waiting, anticipating being able to launch that stuff online. So very excited about that.
Check that.
And there is a thread. I'll have to send it over to you when I'm done. But there is a thread of the My Amityville commentary sort of in this story too, in terms of how stories reverberate over time and sort of become larger in our minds than they may actually be. And that's part of what I always saw with Danny Lutz is, not to belittle his story in any way, but just objectively looking at it, as I mentioned before, with his kind of remembering stories like how they happened in the movie versus how George and Kathy, his parents said they happened.
Right.
Same thing with the Reinhardt family. They are sort of suspecting everyone and everything of some nefarious, somebody murdered our dad,
right,
type of thing. And that suspicion and those conspiracy theories start to become repeated online and podcasts. There's certainly been a blossoming of true crime in every fabric of society over the past decade. It's never really gone away, but there's been a major resurgence of it over the past, 6 or 7 years. And so, yeah, that's sort of, it is an interesting sort of commentary. It's almost an evolution of what the similar commentary that was in My Amityville Horror. So I'm really excited to get it out there. And for anyone interested, Dark Side of the Mountain, check it out.
And of course, you go to ericwalterdocs.com and you have all the links there. And last question before we wrap things up here, and it could be a very short question. I know as the director, filmmaker, I don't always like to answer these things, but
sure.
Amityville, Dark Side of the Mountain, what do you believe? I mean, what is your belief of Amityville and of your new project? Do you have any, or do you try to keep that out of it?
I do try to keep it out of it as far as, objectivity purposes. But if you're asking me outright off the record of the film itself, I do, as I mentioned, I think there's the truth as far as Amityville is concerned. I think the truth is always somewhere in the middle.
Right.
But I do believe that George and Kathy and their kids were actually terrified of something.
Would you spend a night in that house?
Oh, absolutely.
I would too.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. I would be, if I was ever given that opportunity, I would certainly take that up. And as far as the Reinhardt case goes, I actually tend to err on the side of coincidence, which I know is not the most exciting.
Right.
But that's part of why I'm interested in it. There are some coincidence, meaning accidental death on the part of Keith, possibly disappearing on the mountain. The vegetation on those mountains are so thick you could easily disappear, and he had a known heights phobia, which is part of what makes this case interesting. What the hell was he even doing there in the first place? But also, I also think that that these things are connected by people creating drama out of it. But that's true of so many cases. I think in large part that's true of Amityville.
Right.
We didn't get to talk about it, but George and Kathy were openly engaged with a gentleman named William Weber, who was Ronald DeFeo's attorney, who was wanting to write a book about DeFeo's crimes, but then as an epilogue, he wanted to include George and Kathy's story, and that's where it seems that the whole idea of, hey, we could make money off of this was sort of planted. And that was in a week or two after leaving the house. So, I think that George and Kathy knew that the media snowball firestorm had begun and the interest was there. But at the same time, they did leave their
whole
property.
Life.
They left their whole life. They left, they purchased the Amityville house for $80,000, and it was done by selling both of their homes. They weren't sitting on a huge bank account. They basically had all of their finances tied up into this, and they left it, gave it back to the bank, moved to California, to the San Diego area, and were, for a short time living on food stamps and doing these things. Why would they, was this all a stunt? I mean, today, if you were to pull something like that, you may have a reality show based on you or something, but this is 1976. Ultimately, they did pull it off in terms of they had a book and a movie was made and all the rest of it. But I think that if it truly was all nefarious from the beginning and they planned this whole thing, they certainly could have done better themselves coming out of the whole deal. They certainly, it seems, did not make millions from this.
We could, if we had like 3 hours, we could probably go into everything, because I could talk about Amityville all day. And
I knew that was going to happen.
You'll never touch on everything. I mean, because it's such an extraordinary
compendium of it. There's so much to it.
It's
Absolutely
incredible. We're here with award-winning director, producer, editor, and Amityville historian, I'll call you, Eric Walter.
Thank
Check
you.
out his website, ericwalterdocs.com, the new documentary, Dark Side of the Mountain. Eric, it's been fantastic talking to you. I appreciate it.
Oh, I appreciate it. And I'd love to come back on once Dark Side comes out. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
We're on a Decades Artist Spotlight. That's going to do it for another Saturday night. Got to thank Eric Walter, My Amityville Horror. You could buy that online, of course, Amazon.com or any of your favorite retailers. Also got to thank the Ghost Detectives for stopping by tonight. Check them out on Facebook and online, of course, and all their episodes are on Amazon Prime. Next Saturday night, we'll do it all over again. John Corabi, formerly of Motley Crue, on the show. You can listen live every single week. Decades at JoeyKramer.com, the Radio Bold app for your iPhone or Android device, or right here on the river, 105 and 103.5.